trials are inside you now. If you can survive one final test, you can leave this place. This is the hostile womb from which you must claw your way to freedom, to power, to history. You will be a perfect weapon, the most innocent child ever born. You're the future.
When I was a boy, my mother often said to me, get married, boy, and see how happy you will be. I have looked all over, but no girlie can I find to be just like the little girl I have in mind. I will have to look around until the right one I have found. I want a girl just like the girl that married Hero Dan.
When Outlast Trials begins, players are thrust into a world where the line between nightmares and reality blurs in a horrific way. This isn't the typical haunted mansion or derelict hospital that we're used to seeing in horror games or movies. This is a meticulously crafted dystopian nightmare designed by the sinister Murkoff Corporation, where pain and fear serve as the main cause. Murkoff's experiments don't merely attempt to scare the player, they aim to break them. The stage is set with disturbing precision, every corner a reminder that in Outlast Trials, you're not just surviving horror, you are the subject of it. The game's setup plunges us deep into the 1950s Cold War paranoia, mirroring a period when governments experimented with psychological and physical conditioning techniques under the guise of national security. The Murkoff Corporation, a name familiar to fans of the Outlast series, capitalizes on these themes. It is more than just a villain in the game, Murkoff is an embodiment of unchecked power and corporate cruelty, mirroring the brutal experiments conducted by real-world institutions. The twisted logic, all in the name of mental conditioning. This premise makes Outlast Trials more than just a horror game, it's a disturbing commentary on human experimentation, power, and the length to which organizations will go when they are operating beyond oversight. From the first moments in Outlast Trials, the game's setting acts as an oppressive force, closing in on the player. The testing facility is littered with the remnants of prior trials, blood-streaked walls, decayed bodies, and crude makeshift operating rooms that hint at the fates of those who came before. It's a world frozen in time, where remnants of the 1950s, a familiar era of post-war paranoia, are contrasted against grotesque, surreal horror. The facility's design is claustrophobic, and that's intentional. Every hallway seems to close in around you, every doorway leads somewhere worse than the last. Lighting, sound, and level design work in tandem to create an atmosphere that feels like a feverish hallucination. There's an ever-present sense of surveillance, as if eyes are always watching, evaluating every move. This omnipresent observation by the Murkoff Corporation establishes a chilling dynamic. You are lab-rat in a maze, and each step is being studied. The game's world is one of those rare instances where the setting itself feels like a character, a malevolent, ever-present entity determined to crush the player's spirit. One of the most remarkable aspects of Outlast Trials is how it weaponizes isolation. In typical horror games, isolation is used to give players a sense of vulnerability. However, Outlast Trials elevates this trope by making isolation a psychological tool to degrade the player's mental state. There is no real safety in this game. No friendly face to remind you that this nightmare isn't real. The sensation of isolation is intensified by Murkoff's systematic approach to breaking you down, making you feel like the walls themselves are part of the torment. In many ways, this isolation reflects the tactics used in real-world psychological experiments, like the Stanford prison experiment, where subjects were purposefully isolated and stripped of individuality to force compliance. Outlast Trials borrows from these real-world horrors, creating a backdrop that feels distressingly plausible. The walls, the iron-barred doors, and the dim, flickering lights become part of the game's psychological warfare, pressing down on the player like the walls of a claustrophobic cell. The architecture of the testing facility is designed to amplify this feeling. Small, confined spaces limit movement and restricted vision, pushing players to feel trapped. Labyrinthine corridors that twist and wind in seemingly illogical ways disorient the player, while minimal lighting adds to the fear of the unknown. By stripping the player of a clear path, Murkoff's facility reinforces the psychological toll, making it apparent that escape isn't just unlikely, it's nearly impossible. Every horror story needs a monster, but in Outlast Trials, the primary antagonist isn't a creature, it's a corporation. Murkoff is a faceless entity, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, operating far beyond the reach of justice or morality. Unlike traditional horror villains, Murkoff doesn't rely on claws or fangs. Instead, it utilizes power, manipulation, and psychological torment. This form of villainy is unsettling because it reflects our world, where corporations often engage in ethically questionable practices under the shield of corporate secrecy. The Murkoff Corporation operates as both captor and tormentor, dictating every aspect of the player's experience within the facility. Its employees are nameless, often faceless, and wholly obedient, adding to the dehumanization. This lack of direct confrontation with Murkoff personnel makes the experience even more isolating, heightening the sense that you are entirely alone, at the mercy of a pitiless machine. To add to the horror, Murkoff's experiments are presented as scientific advancements. The trials are marketed as a way to improve mental resilience and test human endurance. This twisted justification parallels real-world instances where governments and corporations have engaged in unethical human experimentation. This thin veneer of science as a cover for torture is a recurring theme in Outlast Trials, adding another layer to the horror. It's not just the fear of physical pain, but the knowledge that your suffering has been carefully calculated and justified as part of some grander, cold-blooded experiment.
I want a girl just like the girl that married you.
Fear begins with confinement. Once the player steps into Murkoff's labyrinth facility, the realization quickly dawns. There's no easy way out, and perhaps no way out at all. The sense of entrapment isn't incidental. It's woven deeply into the game's design, turning the testing facility into an active participant in the horror. A constant reminder of the control Murkoff Corporation holds over every aspect of the player's life within these walls. This prison isn't just a setting, it's a carefully constructed psychological trap that forces players to confront helplessness and desperation head-on. The facility in Outlast Trials is designed to be disorientating and claustrophobic, giving players the sense of being lost in an unending maze. The hallways twist and turn unpredictably, creating an atmosphere that makes navigation itself a challenge. Many of the corridors and rooms look similar, further adding to the confusion and sense of being utterly lost. Doors lead into small, confined spaces or back into dead-end hallways, reinforcing the lack of any clear exit. Even as players explore, it becomes clear that the layout isn't here to help them, it's here to keep them lost, scared, and constantly on the edge. This design isn't just about disorienting the player spatially, it's meant to break down their sense of security and comfort. The lack of wide open spaces and the narrow corridors contribute to a feeling of entrapment, as if the walls are closing in. Unlike traditional games where exploration might reveal new areas or rewards, Outlast Trials turns exploration into an unsettling task, forcing players into dark, claustrophobic spaces that only serve to increase their anxiety. Isolation is a common theme in horror, but in Outlast Trials it takes on a new intensity. The setting feels almost completely cut off from the outside world, making the player feel as though they are utterly alone in this place. The few human figures encountered are either enemies or other test subjects, all of whom are driven by their own survival instincts and traumas. The sense of isolation goes beyond physical confinement. It's psychological. The lack of safe spaces reinforces a feeling of relentless danger. Even the brief pauses between encounters don't offer relief, as the atmosphere keeps the tension high. This isolation makes players feel small and powerless within Murkoff's towering, impersonal machinery, where they are just another subject, another number in a long line of victims. In Outlast Trials, players are constantly aware that they are being watched. Cameras are placed strategically throughout the facility, a visual reminder that someone is always monitoring them, evaluating their every move. The sense of surveillance is intense, heightening the pressure of every action. Knowing that Murkoff's eyes are constantly on them adds another layer of psychological tension, turning the game into a twisted performance where the player is both the actor and the audience. This feeling of being under constant surveillance taps into a universal human fear, the fear of losing control over personal freedom and privacy. In the facility, players have no autonomy. They are mere subjects under observation, manipulated by an unseen force. The game effectively uses this surveillance to amplify the atmosphere of oppression, as players are forced to confront the unsettling realization that escape or even survival might just be part of Murkoff's experiment. Part of what makes the facility feel so inescapable is the lack of meaningful choices. Outlast Trials limits the player's options intentionally, creating a sensation of running through a rat maze with no reward at the end. Every door might lead to a dead end, every hallway to another trap. Each time players believe they are moving closer to freedom, the game introduces new obstacles, reminding them that Murkoff controls every path. This deliberate design choice reinforces the sense of entrapment and strips away any illusions of progress or control. The dead ends aren't just physical, they are psychological. Hope is a tool used to manipulate, not to encourage. The lack of real options and the endless loops make the player feel as if Murkoff has already calculated their every move, leaving no real opportunity for escape. With nowhere to hide, no clear path to freedom, players are forced into a survival mindset. The game doesn't offer luxury of traditional combat options. It's a test of endurance, reflexes, and quick thinking under pressure. This survival-centered approach strips away any notion of power or control, forcing players to confront each encounter with limited resources and no real means to fight back. The game's design makes the players experience a constant balancing act between action and caution. Rushing through an area might lead to encounters with enemies or traps, but moving too slow means risking capture or death. By forcing players to rely on limited tools and split-second decisions, Outlast Trials keeps the adrenaline high, making every encounter a test of nerves and strategy.
I want a girl just like the girl that married you.
The game isn't just a test of survival, it's a brutal, calculated experiment in endurance, both physical and psychological. Murkoff Corporation's facility is designed to push every boundary, subjecting players to a relentless parade of horrors intended to erode their resolve. This is not a simple game of avoiding monsters or finding keys. It's a systematic deconstruction of the human spirit, forcing players to confront the limits of their mental and physical endurance. In this chapter, we delve into how Outlast Trials expertly manipulates both body and mind, constructing a uniquely immersive nightmare that goes far beyond the typical scares found in horror games. The first layer of torture in Outlast Trials is the physical toll it takes on players. Every encounter is crafted to keep players constantly moving, constantly fleeing. The facility's structure is not designed for comfort, it's designed to exhaust. Sure, you can knock over enemies with a brick or a bottle, but that is temporary. Tight corridors, narrow spaces, and scattered obstacles demand constant vigilance, draining players as they sprint from one hiding spot to another. resources are sparse, and the lack of weapons forces players into a cycle of desperation and helplessness, relying on speed and luck rather than strength. Exhaustion is part of the game's strategy. The relentless need to run and hide, the adrenaline-fueled sprints down darkened hallways, it all wears players down, physically stimulating the fatigue and desperation their character feels. By forcing players to react quickly and constantly, Outlast Trials captures the sense of a body being pushed beyond its limits. This relentless demand to keep going mirrors the physical torment Murkoff inflicts on its subjects, leaving players as wrecked and drained as the characters they control. While the physical demands of Outlast Trials are draining, the psychological horror is what truly defines the game's impact. This is not a game about cheap jump scares, it's a game that uses fear as a weapon, wearing down the player's mind through a carefully orchestrated assault on their senses. Murkoff's facility is filled with unnerving sounds, distant screams, unsettling whispers, and the ominous hum of machinery. Every auditory cue adds to the constant state of anxiety, making players question what's real and what's not. The visual design further amplifies this dread. Shadows shift and dance, and the distorted lighting creates an eerie atmosphere, while danger feels omnipresent. Every detail in the environment is calculated to induce paranoia, creating an experience where the player never feels fully safe, even when they are alone. This constant barrage of sensory stimuli builds a psychological tension that leaves players on the edge, too scared to move forward, but too terrified to stay still. It's not just the in-game characters who are subject to the experiment, the players themselves are made to feel like subjects, manipulated and observed, with no control over their fate. As players progress through Outlast Trials, they are forced to make difficult decisions to test their limits. Resources are scarce, and every encounter poses a risk that could mean the difference between life and death. In this environment, players must prioritize survival over morality, sometimes betraying others by shutting down a door. The decisions they make in Murkoff's facility aren't just about survival, they are about how much of themselves they are willing to lose to escape. Outlast Trials is a masterclass in the mechanics of fear, showcasing a sophisticated approach that goes beyond traditional horror elements to create an experience that genuinely terrifies. Where many horror games rely on startling players with sudden noises or gruesome visuals, Outlast Trials develops a deeper, more insidious type of fear, a fear that lingers, unsettles, and embeds itself into the player's psyche. Through immersive sound design, atmospheric tension, and the psychological anticipation of danger, the game evolves fear into a complex, layered experience. From the moment players step into Murkoff's facility, they are greeted with an atmosphere that feels alive with menace. Every element within the environment, from the flickering lights to the decaying walls, builds on a foundation of dread. The atmosphere in Outlast Trials doesn't just serve as a backdrop, it's an active participant in the horror, shaping how players perceive their surroundings and intensifying their emotional response. The lighting is strategic, guiding the player's attention while leaving much of the facility cloaked in shadow. This partial illumination creates a constant uncertainty where shadows seem to hide something lurking just out of sight. The narrow spaces, cramped corridors, and oppressive architecture adds to the claustrophobic feeling that resonates with the player. Players can rarely see what lies ahead, forcing them to move cautiously and heightening their vulnerability. This masterful use of environmental cues crafts a mood that is unsettling from start to finish. One of Outlast Trials' most powerful tools, in my opinion, is creating fear through its sound design. The game uses sound not only to alert players to danger, but to play with their expectations and heighten their anxiety. The distant screams, shuffling footsteps, and distorted echoes make the facility feel like it's filled with unseen horrors. These sounds amplify the player's sense of isolation, reminding them that at any moment they could stumble into something deadly. The strategic use of silence is equally important. At times, the game will cut off all background noise, plunging the players into an unnerving quiet that amplifies their own breathing, footsteps, and heartbeat. This use of silence combined with sudden noises keeps players hyper-aware and on the edge, creating an atmosphere where every sound and the absence of sound can signal impending danger. Moreover, the sound is spatially dynamic, meaning that noises are positioned within the environment to give players a sense of direction and proximity. Hearing a sound grow louder or softer as they move makes players feel as though they are being stalked, hunted by unseen enemies. This audio design isn't merely atmospheric, it's immersive, creating an experience where players react instinctively to sound, as if they themselves are trapped within Murkoff's walls. What makes Outlast Trials uniquely terrifying isn't just the presence of danger, but the anticipation of it. The game carefully manipulates when and how players encounter threats, building a psychological pressure that grows with each moment. It's not just about running from enemies, it's about knowing they are somewhere nearby, possibly watching, waiting to strike. In Outlast Trials, the timing of encounters is unpredictable. Players might spend long stretches navigating dark hallways only to stumble upon an enemy when they least expect it. This inconsistency keeps them guessing, unable to establish a sense of routine or predictability. It's a carefully calculated approach that capitalizes on suspense, making every corner, every shadow a potential threat. This uncertainty taps into a primal fear, a fear that is more intense because it's imagined. By letting players' minds run wild, the game forces them to confront the horrors of their own imagination as much as the dangers within the facility. This approach is particularly effective because it plays on the human tendency to fear the unknown, knowing that enemies exist but not knowing when or where they will appear, forcing players to remain vigilant at all times, creating a slow burn tension that's far more impactful than a sudden jump scare. In this way, Outlast Trials cultivates a sustained fear, an anxiety that settles deeply and doesn't dissipate even after encounters are over. One of the most profound sources of fear in Outlast Trials is the sensation of helplessness. The game strips players of power, reducing their ability to defend themselves and forcing them to rely on stealth and cunning. Without traditional weapons or means of direct confrontation, players must adopt a fight or flight mentality, knowing that survival often depends on hiding rather than engaging. The sense of helplessness is reinforced by the game's mechanics. With limited resources and a few places to hide, every encounter becomes a desperate scramble for survival. The knowledge that the player has a few options and that death could come at any moment creates a psychological strain that intensifies as the game progresses. This helplessness doesn't just make the game more challenging, it makes it more terrifying, as players feel as though they are at the mercy of forces they can't control. This enforced vulnerability mirrors real-life psychological studies of fear, where the lack of control over a situation can lead to a heightened anxiety. In the game, this helplessness is central to the experience, making players feel like prey within Murkoff's facility, hunted and unable to escape.
I want a girl just like the girl that married me.
Survival isn't just a goal, it's a cruel challenge that tests every ounce of patience, strategy and endurance a player possesses. While the game immerses players in a horrifying setting with relentless enemies and oppressive atmosphere, the struggle to survive becomes the central focus. Rather than providing players with powerful weapons or even a sense of control, Outlast Trials crafts survival as a precarious balance of risk, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower. Here, survival isn't measured by strength, but by a player's ability to navigate Murkoff's labyrinth of madness while maintaining their sanity. Resource scarcity is a staple of survival horror, and Outlast Trials takes this to a new level. Supplies like health items and tools are not just rare, they are precious, often guarded by challenging encounters or hidden in the darkest, most treacherous corners of the facility. This scarcity forces players to prioritize their actions and make difficult choices, turning every resource into a lifeline that could mean the difference between life and death. Health, for example, is limited, and there are no guarantees that players will find more healing items just when they need them. Every decision to engage in risky behavior or to explore an unknown area becomes weighted with a consequence. Players learn quickly that reckless actions lead to consequences, and careful management of these scarce resources become key to surviving Murkoff's trials. The scarcity forces players into a survivalist mindset, making them weigh each choice and prioritize long-term survival over short-term gains. This lack of resources serves to heighten the tension of the game. Each encounter becomes a potential risk, each dark hallway a gamble, and in a facility where help is non-existent and every corner may be a hidden threat, the value of resources grows exponentially, pushing players to stay cautious, observant, and above all, strategic. Without the ability to fight back effectively, players in Outlast Trials must master the art of stealth. Here, survival isn't about overpowering enemies, it's about avoiding them entirely. This emphasis on evasion requires players to be constantly aware of their surroundings, observing the behaviors and patterns of their foes while plotting a course of action that minimizes exposure to danger. Hiding in dark corners, under beds, or behind debris becomes second nature, as each encounter could lead to deadly consequences if approached recklessly. The stealth mechanics push players to think strategically, forcing them to remain patient and attentive. Unlike traditional games that might reward bold moves or aggressive tactics, Outlast Trials punishes recklessness. Timing, observation, and quick reactions are essential to survival. A poorly timed movement or a miscalculated dash across a hallway can result in death, sending players back to navigate the trial once again. By focusing on stealth, the game depends the sense of vulnerability, reminding players that in Murkoff's facility, they are the hunted, not the hunters. Additionally, the game's AI is designed to increase tension in stealth sequences. Enemies react to subtle sounds, forcing players to tread carefully and avoid unnecessary noise. This AI design, combined with the narrow corridors and limited sightlines, adds an unpredictable element to each encounter, creating an intense atmosphere where players feel constantly pursued. Beyond physical survival, the Trials explores the mental toll that prolonged fear and tension have on a player. The game simulates an environment that doesn't just test the player's skill, but also their emotional resilience. Every moment spent hiding, every close call with an enemy, every narrow escape wears down the player's nerves, pushing them into a state of heightened anxiety and tension. The game's prolonged exposure to horror creates a psychological exhaustion that mirrors what the characters themselves would feel, making players more vulnerable to mistakes and lapses in judgment as they progress. This psychological pressure manifests in gameplay as well. Fear and anxiety build over time when exposed to the gas or traps, for example. The player's mental endurance becomes just as important as their physical skill, adding another layer to the game's survival mechanics, by creating an environment that is as mentally taxing as it is physically challenging. Outlast Trials offers a unique horror experience that lingers beyond the screen. In this way, the game is more than a series of obstacles. It's a grueling psychological journey where survival becomes a matter of mental toughness. The intensity of fear builds over time, gradually eroding players' confidence and leaving them vulnerable to the game's threats.
I want a girl just like the girl that married you.
The appeal of Outlast Trials lies not just in its terrifying atmosphere or relentless enemies, but in the way it pulls players into a psychological cycle of fear, curiosity, and compulsion. Unlike typical horror games that players may dip into for a quick scare, Outlast Trials has a way of embedding itself in the mind, creating an experience that feels both harrowing and addictive. The psychological toll of playing the game becomes part of its allure, making players want to face its horrors again and again, even when they know exactly how much it will cost them emotionally. Survival horror games often engage players by challenging their ability to enter difficult situations, and Outlast Trials excels at this by turning survival itself into an achievement. Every encounter survived, every dark hallway navigated, and every enemy evaded feels like a hard-won victory. The game taps into players' competitive instincts, pushing them to prove again and again that they have what it takes to make it through Murkoff's trials. Each time a player successfully evades an enemy or finds their way through a confusing, terrifying section of the facility, they experience a surge of relief and accomplishment. The satisfaction is immediately undercut by the next challenge, which often feels even more intense and dangerous. The sense of accomplishment from survival drives players to keep going, to test themselves further, despite the knowledge that each new section will bring fresh horrors. This cycle of fear and reward becomes addictive, hooking players into returning to the game, even when it's emotionally exhausting. Outlast Trials doesn't reveal its mysteries all at once. Instead, it doles out fragments of the story, encouraging players to dig deeper into the twisted world of Murkoff Corporation. The lore, the secrets, and the unanswered questions all serve to create a sense of intrigue that drives players forward. The desire to understand what's happening within the walls of Murkoff's facility, to discover the true purpose behind the trials, keeps players engaged, even as they are haunted by what they've already witnessed. This curiosity isn't just about uncovering the plot, it's about understanding the motivations behind Murkoff's twisted experiments and what drives such cruelty. As players uncover documents, overhear conversations, and witness horrific events, they piece together a larger narrative that is both horrifying and fascinating. This breadcrumb trail of revelations creates a strong compulsion to continue, making players eager to delve deeper into the game's twisted story even as it tests their resilience. Over time, Outlast Trials conditions players to respond to fear in new ways, creating a psychological bond between the player and the game that is hard to break. With every encounter, players become more attuned to the game's rhythm, developing an instinct for when danger is near, when to hide, and when to run. This fear conditioning leads players to anticipate threats before they happen, heightening the sense of paranoia and embedding the game's terror into their thought process. As players adapt to the game's environment, they find themselves in a continuous state of high alert, becoming hyper-aware of every sound, shadow and movement. This heightened awareness is taxing on the mind, yet it also creates a unique type of immersion that players find difficult to replicate in other games. Outlast Trials forces players to confront their fear directly, pushing them to become familiar with their reactions and limits, making every escape feel like a personal victory over the game's psychological traps. This conditioning isn't something players can easily shake off. Many, like myself, find themselves thinking about the game long after they've left Murkoff's walls, reliving moments of terror and wondering how they might approach different situations. This psychological footprint is what makes Outlast Trials so impactful. It doesn't just scare player, it changes the way they experience fear itself. One of the most compelling aspects of Outlast Trials is its ability to make players feel as though they are constantly on the brink of failure. The facility is designed to be unforgiving, each section presenting new challenges that feel insurmountable. Yet, with every small victory, players build confidence, pushing themselves further despite the overwhelming odds. This drive to conquer the game's many trials becomes part of the game's appeal, as players grow determined to prove they can survive Murkoff's merciless environment. This dynamic is rooted in the game's psychological manipulation, as Outlast Trials dangles the promise of freedom just out of reach, leading players to believe that with enough persistence they might escape. The feeling of progressing, of getting just a little further each time, is a powerful motivator, transforming the game's horrors into challenges that players feel compelled to overcome. The sense of accomplishment that comes from surviving even the smallest encounter reinforces this drive, creating a cycle of fear and determination that keeps players coming back.